Thank you, Dr. Rice. Hello, everybody. How are you? Good. I know it is, right? It's after lunch. It's a little bit dreary. The upside is nobody's looking outside thinking, I wish I was out there in the rain instead of in this building. Well, I want you to be sure everybody knows that there's some drinks in the back, and I think some of them are caffeinated, so I've got mine, and you're welcome to go grab one of yours to keep you going for the next hour or so. And Dr. Rice told you a little bit about me, and I wanted to, before I get started, just talk to you a little bit about social work and sort of how social work fits into today's discussion about inequality. So can I ask, are there any social workers or social work students in the room? Excellent. Nice to see you all. So I belong to a profession that many of you are about to become a part of that has a really strong commitment to social justice. And so what that means for me as I look at issues around inequality is that I don't just have a responsibility to do good research in those areas and talk to people about them and raise awareness, but I also have a responsibility to do something about that. And so I've spent most of my career working either inside the political system or trying to influence this political system to make a difference in a lot of these areas. I spent 10 years on Capitol Hill. I worked for Senator Daschle, who at the time was the majority leader of the United States Senate, and spent a lot of time trying to help him create policies and get them passed in a way that would be really helpful for people who are the most disadvantaged in our society. I've also spent a lot of time trying to get candidates elected who believe in sort of dealing with inequality and these types of issues that we care about as social workers. So I've worked campaigns everywhere from Louisiana to South Dakota to Connecticut and New York for the past 14 years with success in some years and less success in other years. This wasn't maybe my best year ever working on campaigns. And then I've also spent the last 10 years trying to advocate to make sure that the process is passing policies that are the kind of things that I believe in. So I work on issues around reproductive health and rights. I look at issues around gender equity and try to make sure that social work services are accessible to the largest number of people possible. So those are the kinds of policies I've been working on for the last 10 years. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is this term meritocracy. And it's an important term because this is sort of a frame for us to talk about how our society sees our opportunity to advance. Do we as a society think that we have a meritocracy? How do we know we have a meritocracy? And if we think it should be different, then what can we do about it? What things can we put into place to make those change happen? So I'm going to first start by talking a little bit about some definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page here. And this isn't a huge group, so I'm giving you fair warning, I'm going to ask you to participate. Everybody take a deep breath. You can do it. I heard an uh-oh. I don't know about that. So I want to get a sense a little bit of what you guys are thinking, as well as have you have a chance to see what I'm thinking about this. And then I want to talk a little bit about our evidence around whether or not we have a meritocracy, and then some remedies that we might be able to put into place to do something about any deficits that we see. All right, so let's start with some definitions. If all you know about meritocracy is what I've said so far, then that would be one place to start. But I'm sure you've heard a term or a term like that before. So let me start by asking you, what do you think meritocracy is? When you hear the term, what do you think that might refer to? This is that super awkward moment where everybody waits for someone else to answer. Come on, you can do it. Come on, social workers. What's a meritocracy? Or what would be a meritocracy? Yes, ma'am. Thank you for being brave. Okay, so if you couldn't hear, she said advancement or ruling based on skills or abilities. Wonderful. Anybody else want to take a guess? So that is remarkably close to the official definition of meritocracy. So this definition here is from the American Heritage Dictionary, and it essentially says that a meritocracy is one of two things. It's a system in which talented people are chosen and moved ahead on the basis of their achievement, or it's a situation in which leadership is selected on the basis of intellectual criteria. So if we break this word up, right, we have merit, so people getting ahead because of something that's good about them, right, an ability that they have. And we have the ocracy part of this, which is generally referred to how we rule our systems, right? A democracy has that in it, and that has to do with how we choose the people who run our country. Here's the interesting thing about meritocracy. It's a term that was developed, that was first used in 1958 by a sociologist named Michael Young. He actually didn't mean it as a good thing. He wrote this book called The Rise of the Meritocracy that was a satire that made fun of people who thought that you could move ahead only based on merit. I read a recent article by him where he said he was a little bit appalled that everybody took his idea that he thought was really funny and took it seriously and tried to run with it. It's, I suppose, a good lesson that whatever you put out there in the world might be used the way you want it to be, and it might be used for completely other purposes. So the idea, his idea of meritocracy essentially said that people would only be evaluated on two things, IQ and effort. And if you scored high on IQ and you scored high on effort, you would be allowed to move ahead. And this means that it didn't matter, right, who you were related to, it didn't matter how rich you were, it didn't matter what kind of education you had. The only two things that would matter would be your IQ and your effort. The reason he thought of this as a satire is that he thought that's an impossible system to create, right? How could we ever break down our current system, and how could we ever create a system in which we only valued people on their IQ and merit? But I think that most Americans like the idea of a meritocracy. I think most Americans like the idea of people being able to move ahead based on merit and not on other characteristics that we might see as less relevant. So let's think a little bit about if our society was a pure meritocracy. So if the United States was completely a meritocracy right now, let's think about what that might look like. And I want you to think about sort of pop culture or public culture and sort of our public ideas. Can you think of any examples of something in our culture that suggests you can get ahead just based on your abilities? Can you think of something that's out there that suggests that to people? Do we have any country music fans in the room? But there are some great examples in there of our ideas as a society about meritocracy. So what did you hear Brooks and Dunn say in that song that suggests that people can move ahead based on their merit? Yes, ma'am. Right, we all get the chance. Everybody gets to dance, yep. So that suggests that everybody has access to opportunities, right? Good, what else? What did he say that everybody has the opportunity to do? Mm-hmm. Right, so people come here, and you said two really important things, right? People come to America because of the idea that everything is possible, and you also mentioned the American dream, which we talked about a little bit if you were here for the last session, right? The American dream is the idea that if you work hard enough, and we all have access to opportunities, so if you work hard enough, you can achieve the American dream, which might look like owning your own business, it might look like owning a house, it's a little bit different for everybody. But people come from all over the world to America because of that idea that there's a lot of opportunity here. Anything else that you heard there about opportunities? Yes. Right, that anybody can be the president, right? Which could be true or could be not true. They also said the flip side, right? That any of these kids might go to prison, and any of these kids might become president. I don't know about you, but as a not very much a Yankees fan, I sort of enjoyed that the kid who might go to prison had a Yankees shirt on. That might be my favorite moment of this entire video. I'm a Red Sox fan. Y'all don't have to agree with that. It's totally fine. But absolutely, this idea, right, that anybody can be president is a really big part of our idea of the American dream and our idea of meritocracy. But that doesn't necessarily play out in real life, right? So let's take a look at a couple things. So, can anybody be president? Theoretically, what are the requirements to be president in the United States? Do you have to be rich? Do you have to be a man? You have to be born in the United States, yes. Or in Panama when it was a U.S. territory. You have to be 35. That's a good, I don't know that there was ever a specific requirement, but many of our presidents have for sure. Right, so you have to be 35 and you have to be born in the United States. Anything else? And yet, what do all of the presidents on that side of my slide have in common? They're all men. And what do all of them except for one have in common? They're all white. Now, if I was closer to this, I could put up my hand at a line and point out the point at which women could not be president, right? Until 1920, women couldn't vote in the United States. Until 1865, African Americans couldn't vote in the United States. So we wouldn't necessarily expect to see women or people of color as president before that point. But we're going on close to 100 years now here, right? Where women have had the right to vote in the United States. So we don't see any women on that side, and you only see one person of color. It also used to be a requirement that in order to hold elective office in the United States, in order to vote in the United States, you had to own property. That requirement no longer exists on paper, but what do a lot of these people have in common in terms of their economic class? Oh, she was just scratching her head. I was totally just going to call on her. Twitching is dangerous when I'm up front. Twitches, they call my attention. Yes? Most of the people who have been president of the United States, not all, but the vast majority of them have come from fairly well-off families, right? And in fact, in the past few presidents, right, we have 2 presidents out of the same wealthy family. So we've got a group of people on that side who don't look like America, right? If we're going to tell people everybody can be president, they don't look like it. Yes? Right, so a lot of these people had connections, right? They got into politics because somebody they knew was already in politics. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point, right? The amount of money in American politics today really changes the playing field in a lot of places because it requires, you have to have the money to put into a campaign. You have to have the time to take off of work to run for office, right? It's a time-consuming thing to run for office. I'm pretty sure if I told my boss, I'm just not going to show up to work for like 4 out of the next 5 days for a year because I'm going to run for office, I'm not sure he'd be really okay with that anytime soon. I think I saw a hand over here. Right, we've got some good representation there from Harvard, from Yale, right? We've got some very excellent colleges represented up there for sure. So who do you think the group of people on the left is? Do they look like a group of people on the right? Can you guys see them over there? Oh, you guys have a screen over there too. Hey, look at that, good planning. So what's different about the group of people on the left? They're women. So these are 18 female heads of state from around the world. And many of these are from countries that Americans would consider less progressive than we are, or less attuned to gender equality. And yet, these 18 countries have managed to elect women to be their heads of state, and the United States hasn't. So it's an interesting question how we create a society where we tell people that anyone can be president, but that's not necessarily the case when it actually comes to putting things into practice. So this is one way to look at whether or not we have a meritocracy. And this lack of representation among, at the top, at the presidency, is mirrored in almost every other way that we elect leaders in our society. So you might say, right, we've only elected 44 presidents in American history. It's going to be a small number to begin with. But currently, out of the 535 members of Congress, when the new Congress gets sworn in January, the people that y'all just voted for on Tuesday, that group will have 100 women in it, 100 out of 535. That is the largest number of women who has ever been in the United States Congress, and it's still roughly 1 out of 5. So what percentage are women of the United States? If you're not sitting in a social work class, what percentage are women? Roughly half, 51%. And yet women are roughly 20% of Congress. Women are slightly less than that if we look at state legislators. Women make up significantly less than half of governors. and significantly, 20% is about the top for looking at CEOs or C-level executives in Fortune 500 companies and other large companies as well. So we look at roughly, in the United States, 13 to 20% of people in significant leadership positions tend to be people who are women. And we see very similar numbers when we look at representation among ethnic and racial minorities as well. All right, so here's another way to look at it. And if you were in the last session, you heard a little bit of a discussion about economic mobility. And I really want to break economic mobility up into two things. So economic mobility is the idea that everybody has a chance, right? The idea that wherever you start out, whether you start out at the top rung or the bottom rung, you could rise or fall based on your abilities. So not just who your parents are, not just how much money was in the bank when you were born, but something that has to do with you and your abilities. So I'm going to show, this one's not a country video for those of you who are not country fans. Just a short video that was put together by the Pew Charitable Trust that highlights these two and sort of the differences between them. So these two types of mobility are important. So when I think of working out there in the field as a social worker, a lot of parents have one fundamental goal, which is that they want their kids to be better off than they were themselves, right? So a lot of you might have parents who feel the same way. It was really important to them that you go to college because they want you to have a better job than they did. Or it's really important for you to look for certain types of employment because they wanted you to have a better job than they did. And in fact, the number one thing that I hear from parents, if their kids are thinking about becoming a social worker, is, well, let me ask you, since a lot of you are in that position, what do you think is the number one worry of parents whose kids are thinking about social work? They're never going to make any money. Is my kid going to come to your relatively expensive school and go into a lot of debt and never make enough money the rest of his or her life, which is a completely legitimate concern, right, for parents. So parents are often really concerned about this idea of absolute mobility. They want their kids to have things that they didn't have themselves. They want to be able to see some progress in generations. But as the video points out, there's also this issue of relative mobility because as a society, right, we see inflation, we see prices overall rising. And so even if we see that everybody is getting a little bit richer as we go, if we don't see any opportunity for people to move out of the lower income rings and up into the higher ones, then we have to question whether or not we have a society that is rewarding people based on merit or rewarding people based on some other factor that has to do with the neighborhood they were born into, or their parents' education, or something else that doesn't connect to that individual person's merit. So one way that we look at whether or not we have a meritocracy are who have the important positions, right? Who do we elect into leadership? Who makes the decisions that affect how we live every day? Another way is to look at how our generations change. If somebody's born into one income rung, is that the income rung that they're doomed to be in the rest of their lives? And sometimes it's good, right? If you're born into a really high income rung, maybe that you hope to stay in that income rung for the rest of your life. So that's another way to look at whether or not we have a meritocracy. Since you're a room full of people who all have some sort of connection to education, let's talk a little bit about how education plays into this and how merit and education combine. For this next little part of our discussion, I'm going to focus on earnings and relative earnings. And I want to say that I'm not suggesting that what somebody makes is the best way to judge their status or their worth or any of those things what they mean in our society. But earnings do give us a really good opportunity to measure a specific outcome across different groups of people. And so for the sake of this discussion, we're going to use earnings. And the statistics I'm going to give you in the next few minutes come from the Center for Work on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University. It's from a report that they did recently called Separate and Unequal, looking at education in America. All right, so the first thing that they looked at is your race and the schools that you go to. And what they found out was that if they split schools into selective colleges and open access colleges, so the extremes of this would be your Harvard and Yale versus your community college, you find that 89% of white students were headed to the selective schools as compared to, you can see the numbers in the green and the blue here. I'm really tempted to point, even though you guys can't see the screen that I'm pointing at. So 72% of Hispanics and 68% of African Americans, whereas much larger proportions of people who identify as Hispanic and African American go to the open access schools. Now, you might argue, but maybe it's just that white students are coming out of high school better prepared for the competitive colleges. When you actually control for factors around GPA and preparedness, you still see a difference between these two. So if I look at students who have the same GPA, I'm going to see that controlling for those other things, white students are still more likely to go to the competitive schools than Hispanics and African Americans. What do you think might be some of the reasons that that is different between these groups? What might be some reasons that that white kids have opportunities to go to selective schools that aren't available to students who are Hispanic or African American? Yes. Legacy and finances, right? So if you were in the last session, you heard about this new career path that you can choose called an educational consultant, which is essentially somebody that a well-off parent can hire that helps get their kid into the right preschool and the right middle school and the right high school and the right college. And those people know the process, they know the people, and they can sort of help walk you through. There is also the idea specifically of legacy acceptance, which is that I get accepted to a school because my parent went to that school. I don't know about you, neither of my parents went to college, so legacy didn't help me at all. And the other issue you mentioned, right, is finance, right? If we are looking at income that is disproportionately distributed throughout our society and wealth disproportionately distributed throughout our society, that's going to make a difference in where I go to school. What else? Sure. That is an excellent question. It varies drastically depending state to state. So there are states that have made essentially are requiring race-blind admissions. So there are states where you are not legally allowed to consider race in terms of your application process. State law is allowed to cover that, and so some states will encourage diversity, some states will encourage affirmative action, and other states won't. Part of the problem, though, is whether or not kids even apply to different schools. So a lot of students who might be eligible for a more competitive school, they don't know anybody who's ever gone there. Their high school counselor doesn't know anybody who's ever gone there. None of their friends know anybody who's ever gone there, so it doesn't occur to them to apply to those schools. And so if you want to change who goes to what school, part of the process has to be changing what schools people apply to, and then looking at the process that they're admitted. So that's a great question, thank you. Other reasons you can think of that these students might be applying in different ways? Okay, so they might not be applying to college at all, right? Because it might just not be something that's part of the culture that they came from. That's actually a really good segue into my next slide. Thank you very much. So what your parents did in terms of college education has a huge influence on what you do in terms of college education. And this one is a little bit hard to read, but the pink are the white students here. And so what you can essentially see is this is what percentage of students, their parents went to college. And the more likely, you're more likely to go to college in the United States if your parents went to college. Now that's not always true, right? I just said that neither of my parents went to college, and I went to college for roughly 400 years. So those two things are not completely correlated with each other. But how many of you are college students right now? All right. How many of you had at least one parent who went to college? Right? So just about half, I would say, had at least one parent who went to college. So somebody in your family knew something about the college application process, had some idea about what to do. And I've got somebody over here shaking her head. And it's not to say that you can't get to college if you don't have that, but it does create extra barriers, right? Because you're figuring it all out from scratch without sort of a guide to walk you through. So we know that how your parents went to school affects how you go to school. It also sometimes affects their outlook on education. Sometimes parents who didn't go to college will say, well, it's not that important, right? And they're not in a position to be helpful, or they're not in a position to encourage students, their children, to do that. So that can have an influence there as well. Yes. Mm-hmm. So was he shocked to find out that you were going to have to pay? So his degree didn't transfer, and so it's a very different system, right? And that's a really good point, right? One of the groups of people who really struggle in college application are children of immigrants, not necessarily because they're not prepared, right? Again, not because they lack merit, but because their parents aren't familiar with the system here. So even if your parents did go to school in another country, that might not necessarily be helpful in the process of understanding the system here and helping your child through it. He has a wife, she'll make sure everything else gets taken care of. He can focus on work. Good. What else? Right. If she is of reproductive age, she may at some point decide to have another kid and stay out of the workforce for a while. Absolutely. Anything else you can think of? So would you like to hear the worst thing an employer has ever said to me in this regard? It's bad. Do you want to hear it? It's gonna make you a little bit sad, but I'll cheer you up at the end, I promise. So I actually had an employer once who was having exactly this issue with a concern about who to hire between two people. What it actually came down for him is that he did decide to hire the woman, but he decided to offer her less money than he had been planning to offer the man. And I said, dude, A, illegal, B, what are you doing? And he said, and I quote, don't worry about it. She has a husband. He'll take care of her. Swear to God. Stack of Bibles. Swear to God. Right? So there is this idea that the man's responsibility is to be the breadwinner, right? And take care of his family. And the woman's responsibility is to make sure that the home is taken care of. And it actually doesn't matter what your household looks like. It doesn't matter if that's how it works in your household. As long as that's our society's perception, then we will continue to hire men and women who are parents at different rates, or hire them, either hire them differently or pay them different amounts of money. As long as my expectation is, well, if I hire you, you're going to have to get home early every night because you're going to have to meet the kid at the bus, then fine, I'll hire you, but I'll offer you less money to do it, right? And there's some really good, valid questions about how do we decide to split this kind of work in our society, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the purposes of this discussion, it doesn't matter. It matters what people's perceptions are. It matters what people's stereotypes are. I do have one more. Let's talk just for a moment about religion and how religion affects how we get hired. And again, right, there's no reason to assume that people who come from different religious backgrounds should in any way, shape, or form have different abilities, different merit, different IQ, anything like that. This study is out of my alma mater, the University of Connecticut, and they, again, this really popular thing, sent out a bunch of fake resumes, and some of them had the line that the student was a member of the Muslim student group. Some of them had a line that the student was a member of the Jewish student group, I can't remember actually if it was Christian or Catholic student group, or just a generic student association, right? So the students who had nothing on their resume about religion were the most likely to get called back. The group that was the least likely to call back were the people who had something identifying them as Muslim. In fact, they got 42% less calls than the other resumes. And the title of this in my alumni newsletter was "Great Resume, Too Bad About Your Religion." And this is certainly an issue that people are dealing with all across the country, because we all have the right to display our culture and our religion in any way we see fit, right? Whether you wear a headscarf or a cross or a Star of David, right? We all have the option to do that. And yet, going into a job interview, that very well could be held against you in some way, even though, again, there's no reason to suggest it has anything to do with your merit. The other number that's on here on the top is just for your information. This is the number of complaints that have been filed at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for people who say they're being discriminated against because they're Muslim. In 1992, they got roughly just under 1,400 complaints that year. In 2010, it was almost 3,800, so that number had gone up by almost 3 times in that intervening time period. All right. So we have now gotten through the depressing portion of today's program. Let's talk about what we can do about it. Let's talk about some of the options that we have as individuals, as social workers, as members of society, as people who someday are going to be hiring people, right? You all are someday going to be in a position to sort of put some of these things into place. And I'm going to focus on areas that come out of my research and my area of work, which tends to focus around gender issues, but there are a lot of these for any of these different areas that we've talked about. So the first thing is that we need to ask a question. Do we, as a society, want a system based on merit? So what do you think? Do we, as a society, want a system that is based on your abilities and not based on your race, your gender, your parenthood status, your religion, any of these other things? Mm-hmm. Okay, so she says it's a no-brainer, and she sort of insinuated it was a dumb question, unless she backed it off. It's fine. No, I'm not offended, I promise. What might be some other answers to this question, though? So for you, it's a no-brainer. What might be some other people's perspective on this? Anybody want to argue against it? But there have to be some benefits to the current system, right? If there's no benefits to the current system, we wouldn't keep doing it. So what are the benefits? Yes?
Can I argue against it?
Yeah?
Yeah, sure. So it sounds good if it were fair, but the problem is you've got the power structure deciding what the merit is, which pretty much leaves everyone else in the dust.
Right, and that's great, right? So the next question is, what does merit mean? And so if you guys couldn't hear, essentially what he said is, if the people who are currently in power are the ones who are deciding what merit is, then it's going to be really difficult to expect them to come up with some totally objective measure of merit. And go ahead. Right. So essentially what she said, right, is if we're going to judge merit based on how good of an education that you got, then we have to look at who has the opportunity to get that education. And issues around access to education in the United States go all the way back to early childhood education. African American boys in preschool are 3 times more likely to get suspended from preschool. Did you know you could get suspended from preschool? There you go. African American boys in preschool are 3 times more likely to get suspended from preschool than white boys. And if you want to know more about this, there was maybe some of you heard this, a phenomenal episode of This American Life called Is This Working? That looked at discipline in schools, and this is one of the things they talked about, right? So access to education isn't just about who can get into college or who can get it, who's getting a good high school education, but it goes all the way back, right? So absolutely, figuring out what merit is a big problem here. Anybody else want to argue the other side of this? Merit is bad?
Well, I think it goes back to the title of your presentation, which is the myth of meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of meritocracy is built around mythological narratives that we impose on our society. So we've created a narrative that everyone has equal opportunity, that everyone starts from the same base, that everyone starts with the same, that everyone starts at home plate. And a lot of people are born on third base and think they got a home run.
So if you can hear that, he used one of my favorite analogies, right? That the idea of meritocracy is that everybody's starting at home plate, but in fact, many people start at third base and they think they've hit a home run when they make it around to home, right? So the system, it's hard to imagine what a completely meritocratic system would look like. It's hard to imagine how we would do that. And almost instantly when I think about it, my mind goes to a very unwieldy bureaucracy, right? There would be paperwork, there would be tests, there would be somebody to review the paperwork and the tests. That would take a while. It would get lost. I worked for the federal government for 10 years. You'd have to fill out the form again. You'd have to fill out a different form because you filled out the wrong color form. I might be dealing with some of my repressed issues around the bureaucracy for this moment, right? So it's hard to imagine what that system would look like. But here's the biggest barrier to meritocracy is this last question. the people who are in power, and you guys have alluded to this, the people who are in power would have to be the ones to decide on a new system. And the people who are in power are there because the current system worked for them. And so it's going to be really hard to convince people who are in power, let's create an entirely new system that is going to be not as good for you or people like you or your kids, right? To say that to people, we want you to vote against your own self-interest, and we want you to push for policies that are against your own self-interest. That's a hard thing to ask people to do, right? It's a really hard thing to ask people to do. But let's say that we have decided that this is a no-brainer, and we want to move forward with a system that is more merit-based, maybe not necessarily entirely merit-based. Here's some examples of ways to do that. And one of my favorite examples of this is simply transparency, right? If we had more information about how much money people make and how hiring decisions are made, it's a lot harder for employers to be biased or to be unfair if they have to publicly explain why they made the decisions that they did, right? So think about that fabulously wonderful boss I had who said he was going to pay a woman less than a man because she had a husband and he could take care of her. If he had to say that in public to justify why he was paying her that, he wouldn't say it, right? And he probably wouldn't have made the same decision. So I believe really strongly that if you can't justify a decision that you're making in public, then it's probably a decision that you want to think about twice. So one example of this is to make our system more transparent. But that's great in principle, right? Now, if I said to you, every paycheck you ever have for the rest of your life, everybody else will know how much money you make. Does that make you uncomfortable at all? Anybody? No? A lot of people don't like that idea. A lot of people feel that their salary is something that's really, really private. I did a study a few years ago looking at women who identified as lesbian and bisexual and looking at their physical and mental health. And I asked people questions like, how many sexual partners have you had? What illegal drugs have you used? How much do you drink on a regular basis? I asked people questions about behavior that was really personal. You want to know the questions they were least likely to answer? How much money do you make? And, although not related but interesting, how much do you weigh? Those were the two questions that were left blank. And these are people who had told me every person they had ever had sex with for the last 50 years, but they did not want me to know how much money they made, and they did not want me to know how much they weighed. Society is fascinating. So transparency is attractive for a lot of reasons, but it is uncomfortable for some people, so that's something worth thinking about. So this picture that I have up here is one example of a policy that encourages transparency. It's called the Paycheck Fairness Act. As a social worker, I love this picture because the really, really short woman with the curly hair in the front, that's Barbara Mikulski. She's a United States Senator and a social worker. And the woman to her, that way, her left, yes, in the red, also with the curly hair, is Debbie Stabenow, who's also a United States Senator and a social worker. The Paycheck Fairness Act essentially says a couple of things. It says you cannot be fired for talking to your coworkers about how much money you make. Seems like it should be pretty straightforward. But in many states, you absolutely can be fired or disciplined for talking about your salary. And this is really important for a number of reasons. Number one, it makes these decisions public. But it also means that we can take action based on them. Did you have a question? Right. And not just men and women, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons for inequity in paychecks. Some of the ones we didn't talk about today is that your weight affects how much money you get paid, statistically speaking. If you're a man, every inch of height that you have adds to your paycheck. Weird, but I swear to God, it's true. So there's a lot of reasons, there's a lot of inequities in pay that transparency can help with. This one the goal is to focus on gender-based pay, but it would help other areas as well. Have any of you heard of a woman named Lilly Ledbetter? Okay. Lilly Ledbetter used to work for Goodyear. She worked for Goodyear in the 60s and 70s when women didn't work for Goodyear. Most women didn't work outside of the home. They certainly didn't work for Goodyear. She worked her way up to manager. She worked for Goodyear for a couple of decades. She got an anonymous note in her mailbox one day that showed her salary and the salaries of all the other men who did the same job that she did at Goodyear. And she was making substantially less than them, like more than I think $20,000 less than them. So Lilly Ledbetter sued under the Equal Pay Act. Her case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was denied. And the reason that it was denied is that they said the discriminatory act happened the first time you got a paycheck that was less than those men, and that's when you should have sued. Well, why didn't she sue then? She didn't know. So the very first law that Barack Obama signed when he became president was called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. And that law says that every paycheck that you get that is unequal is a new discriminatory act. So even if you didn't know 20 years ago, if you know now, you can sue. It actually doesn't help Lilly Ledbetter because it's not retroactive. So she actually never, she wrote a book and she made some money though, so hopefully she's doing all right. But she never got money from Goodyear. But the problem is that change in the law means that she can sue, but it means that that person who handed her that slip anonymously could still be fired for telling her that she made less money than the men around her, right? That act of informing her could still be the basis for firing. And that's one of the big things about the Paycheck Fairness Act, that it tries to make that more transparent. This is a proposed piece of legislation. It was not successful in this Congress. I'm going to go out on a really big limb and say it will not be successful in the next Congress. But it's a really interesting idea, and we have seen some progress. President Obama signed an executive order that says that all federal contractors have to abide by this law. So even though the rest of us don't have to, if you have a contract with the federal government, you have to talk about how much money you pay people, and you can't fire somebody for talking about their pay. So transparency is one option here. This might be my favorite slide of the whole day. Let's just take a moment and enjoy. I particularly like the look on the baby's face in this picture on the left. That baby seems a little bit nervous about this whole thing. So the next thing to think about is not a legal remedy at all, right? But a change in the way that we think about what's men's work and what's women's work and how we balance all the stuff. So the study on the left says that fathers are happier when doing more housework. I can't tell you the number of women I know who printed the study out and just left it laying around. Right, but it's not just a stereotype in our society that housework is women's work. It's actually statistically true that women do, on average, almost 2 more hours of housework per day, people, than men do. And 3 hours more of child care per day if they have kids under the age of 5 at home. So that means that women with kids under the age of 5 do an average of 6 hours a day of childcare on top of their full-time jobs. And men with kids under the age of 5 do an average of 3 hours a day of childcare. So that's gonna affect everything else about your life, right? It's gonna affect how much time you have to study for that next promotion at work. It's gonna affect how much time you have to go back to school and get classes if you're doing a disproportionate amount of the work at home. I also really like this next study, which says that dads who do housework have more ambitious daughters. So I have a daughter. I love this article. What does this mean? This article essentially says that if parents talk about, girls can do anything, right? You can have any career you want. You can work outside of the home. You can do whatever you want. That's great. But girls who see that their dads chip in at home believe that. Girls who don't see that their dads chip in at home hear it, but they don't believe it because we believe what we see much more than we do what people tell us. So fathers who did more of the housework had daughters who were much more willing to say they wanted to have non-traditional careers, talked about a wider range of careers that they were interested in than kids who were not in that situation. Interestingly, there was no connection for sons. Sons essentially looked at the same set of ideas about careers, regardless of how much housework their fathers did at home. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is family and medical leave. So if you in the United States are a full-time employed person, either a man or a woman, and you and your significant other decide to have a baby, how much time off do you get from work? It depends on your employer. What does the federal government require that you get? In some situations, it's 3 months unpaid. Nope. The requirement by the federal government for paid maternity or paternity leave in the United States is 0. Absolutely 0. Which is not to say that some employers don't do it anywhere. And in fact, some states have passed laws that require leave. So I live in New York. New York requires 6 to 8 weeks of paid maternity leave for women who have kids. New York has no such requirement for men. So there's no required paid paternity leave in New York. The other countries that you see up here, this is mandated federal paid family leave in all of these different countries. And you'll see that it goes from a high of 50 weeks in Canada. But there are even countries that we would not normally think of as, countries that are way more progressive than us. Mexico offers 12 weeks a year. Spain offers 16 weeks a year. So we're the only developed country without any paid leave. It actually used to be us and Australia. And about 2 years ago, Australia abandoned us and implemented a requirement for paid paternity and maternity leave. Men get a minimum of 2 weeks, and women get a little bit more, depending on what the situation is. Now, that's not to say that if you have a baby, you have to go back to work the next day. I don't recommend it. You're not going to feel up to it, I promise. In the United States, your employer, if they employ 50 or more people, and you have worked there full-time for a year, is required to offer you 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and you can, in many places, use your vacation and your sick leave to come up with that. Was that a question, or you're just leaning on your hand? Like I said, there are some states that do have more requirements than that. And there are a lot of companies that are trying to be seen as really family friendly. So Google just instituted a couple of months of paid leave for both men and women to try to attract more families to them. But right now in the United States, there is no requirement for this. So what does this mean? This means that no federal workers in the United States have access to family leave. 12% of state and local employees in the United States have access to federal leave, and of people in the private sector, roughly 40% work in companies that meet requirements that they have some sort of leave. So having kids in the United States is a huge risk for a lot of people, right? In terms of money, in terms of keeping your job, in terms of being able to provide for your family. And the fact that even the places that do provide more for women than they do for men, reinforces this idea that women should be home with their kids and men should be at work making money. And so that difference has a lot of challenges as well. This also means that a lot of people don't have access to sick leave. In Connecticut, they just passed a law that said that employers have to let you go home if you're sick, which, as somebody who eats in restaurants, I would really much rather the people who are there who are sick go home rather than stay at work and get other people sick. And that public health concern was one of the big reasons for the law. But it also means that if people have sick kids, they can go home and help their families. So these are just a couple of ideas, right? These are some things that might make a difference in some of these areas that we've talked about. But I want to open up for you for questions about this or anything else. If you have policies, are there things that you can think of that would be helpful in making a difference in some of this? Or if you have questions about anything else. So what questions do you have? There's a lot of twitching going on. Y'all have to stop the twitching. Makes me very nervous. Are there other policies that you can think of or things that social workers should be doing or other people should be doing that might give us a more merit-based system in the United States? Nothing? Oh, thank you. So if you could, the question is really why teachers make so much less money than other people with the same education in our society. And the interesting thing is that that's a fairly distinct American perspective. So there are a lot of countries where teachers make a significantly higher amount of money, relatively speaking, because teaching and education is seen as really important. Now the interesting thing, right, is that if I tell people that I'm a teacher versus I'm a professor, they assume different things. We do pay our college professors more money than, typically, more money than we pay our elementary school teachers. So we do at some point recognize that, that difference in college. But if we're gonna talk about education and money, can we talk about student loans for a second? Right? Anybody here take out student loans? Anybody? Yes. So I'm still paying mine off. Woohoo. Only like 10 years to go. There is right now in the United States over $1 trillion of student loan debt. $1 trillion of student loan debt. And the cost of college relative to inflation is continuing to increase by more, right? So you are paying more, relatively speaking, for college than people who went to college 10 years ago or 20 years ago, even if we adjust for inflation. Well, if we want to talk about merit and we want to talk about equal access, we've got to talk about how much money it costs. And in the last session, there was a question about, there was a suggestion about free access to education. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but I think most of us can agree we cannot handle for the cost of college to continue to increase at the rate it is. And we certainly can't afford for our college students to keep borrowing money at the rate that they are. It's not a sustainable system. And at some point, we're going to see, there's a lot of economists who would suggest that we're going to see a bubble pop in education, similar to the bubble that we saw pop in housing in 2008. And that's not going to be good for anybody. So that's definitely an equal access issue that we need to think about. Other suggestions, ideas, questions? At this point in class, I always am tempted to say Bueller. Oh, look, you guys still know who Ferris Bueller is. Yes. My reference is good for at least one more year. Wonderful. Any other questions? All right, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much for coming. It was nice to meet you all.